Welcome everyone to my mini course on how churches can facilitate civic discussion, and maybe even more important, why they should. My name is Reverend Rich Tafel. I am the pastor at Church of the Holy City, and I am looking forward to sharing with you what we have learned in facilitating these very important discussions in our culture. Now, usually when I make this presentation, I have to convince the audience that there is a need for civic discussion. I will not need to do that today. As I am recording this, much of the country is aflame in discord, and there's never been a more important time in my life in this country for us to develop the ability to speak to each other in civil terms. And I believe churches have not only a unique opportunity, but a responsibility to step up and lead the way. Let's begin with my presentation. As I said, our goal here today is to learn how your church could facilitate dialogue, and I will be stressing why you should, with a brief part about how we've gotten here in the first place. What I've always contended, and I think is being seen right now, is when we lose the ability to hear those that we disagree with, we turn to violence. So politics, although it has a very negative name, is the arena traditionally where we have solved very complex differences in a peaceful manner. When our political systems break down, when our academic institutions aren't providing the space for dialogue, when our media doesn't provide space for dialogue, that loss will have very dangerous repercussions for the culture. And I think we're experiencing that now. One of the biggest drivers of this inability to have civic discussion right now is something called hyper-partisanship. Hyper-partisanship is different from our traditional left-right, Republican, Democrat partisanship that we're more familiar with. Hyper-partisanship posits that my side is absolutely right, good, and true. Your side is not something that I just simply disagree with. Your side is dangerous to my family, dangerous to my own survival, dangerous for the country, and in fact, your side is evil. And both of our political parties have engaged in this hyper-partisanship where we no longer have the ability to disagree with respect. We must demonize each other. And it has led to a sort of trench warfare where we fight each year thinking that if our side wins the election and crushes the evil enemy, we will have peace. That has not worked out. Now, this hyperpartisanship and the general inability in the culture to have civic discussions is also being driven by a social media empire that's driven by profits. YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter know that when you are on a platform and you are getting fed what you already believe, you're more likely to stay on it, and that leads to increased dollars. So even when there have been efforts of reform within these tech platforms, they've been shot down because they do not yield the funds. So there is technology driving this hyperpartisanship. Traditionally, we looked at journalism and the news to give us an unbiased, objective as possible view of what's going on. But unfortunately today, again driven by the profit motive, our cable networks have basically carved up the country into interest groups and decided that if they feed their side, they will have higher ratings. Those higher ratings will drive higher profits. The more angry people get, the more likely they are to watch. And so what has happened is our media empires are really driven by a profit motive that feeds on hyperpartisanship. Some more than others, but primarily the three large cable news networks, MSNBC, CNN, and Fox, have all decided what part of the market they want and what part of the market they will go against. This drives hyperpartisanship, where people now live in information bubbles without hearing the other side. This leads to what I would describe a hellish mindset. According to Swedenborg, the hells come into us not by arguing what is good and true, but they pervert it, setting aflame the fire of appetite and delusion, so that all we know we share their appetites and delusions. In other words, the dark forces that are out for our lives, fighting the good angels, they are feeding on our self-righteousness, that when we are sure about ourselves, then we have no reflection. Self-awareness and reflection are fundamental to any regeneration or redemption, and they don't want that. So they want us in spaces where we are with people who completely agree with us and demonize those that disagree. This polarization now has impacted every aspect of American life. We have just been in the midst of a pandemic. For a brief moment, people pulled together. There was some unity. There was common ground. There were common facts. Very quickly, this went into polarized political corners, masks or not masks, open or closed. And despite the fact that we all don't really know the way out of this pandemic, we're all doing the best we can. We all could use a lot of humility and a lot of support of each other. We've actually turned on each other in the middle of a pandemic to return to the meaning making, which is our partisan worldview. I argue that churches have been largely absent from facilitating dialogue in this space, and we have unique opportunity. This is Church of the Holy City in Washington, where I'm the pastor. Anyone who says they seek to follow Jesus would have to be bound by his call to first love your neighbor, but love your enemy. That's a challenge. He says that the greatest must be the least and speaks about servant leadership. He says, blessed are the peacemakers. On the cross, he says, Father, forgive them. And when he speaks about people at the altar who are praying, he says, first go and be reconciled with your brother. Followers of Jesus have an obligation to be involved with reconciliation and hearing a variety of viewpoints. Why churches don't lead? Well, unfortunately, many churches have become themselves hyper-partisan. That means that instead of being a place to host a dialogue, they have chosen one of the partisan sides and are putting their theology in support of hyper-partisanship. Let me give two quick examples of how this plays out in conversations I've recently had. What's interesting is I have Dietrich Bonhoeffer on the screen, a German theologian who opposed Hitler and is one of the more famous Christian leaders of the 20th century. Both those who argue against the dialogue from the left and the right, interestingly enough, quoted Dietrich Bonhoeffer to me. On the progressive left, they've said to me, one pastor said, look, we are in Germany. In the 1930s, Hitler is rising to power. And as Hitler rises to power, the church, in that case, for the most part, aligned themselves to this fascist leader. We're in the same situation. And it's a Bonhoeffer moment. We have to oppose the horrible forces that are rising up in power. And that means I don't want to dialogue with Nazis. The Republican Party is made up of Nazis. Donald Trump is Hitler. And so therefore, our only role is to be in opposition, as Bonhoeffer was. Now, when I speak to pastors on the right, they reference Bonhoeffer. They say, we are in a 1933 moment. The forces of secularism, Nazism, socialism that were rising in Germany are rising here. These are anti-church. These are anti-faith. These are anti-family elites found in the Democratic Party. If they come to power, they will use their force to destroy my family, our schools, our way of life, and go after policy issues like our tax deduction. So they look at our current president and say, we're in a King Cyrus moment where the king helped the Israelites and treated them well, although he was a ruthless king and not Jewish, he led the Israelites back to their homeland. This is a Bonhoeffer moment. We have to stand up like Bonhoeffer did to the forces that were destroying the church. So what we see in both cases, interestingly enough, is calling it a Bonhoeffer moment. Why do they both call it a Bonhoeffer moment? One of the reasons is because Hitler is one of the greatest examples of evil in modern history. Everybody's opposed to Hitler. Nobody favors Hitler. Sure, there are far-right, alt-right groups or whatever, or Nazis that might wave the Nazi flag, but for the most part, everybody's against Hitler. Hitler was evil. What we want in the partisan debate is an evil enemy, because once we've called our opponent Hitler, there's no need for dialogue. There's no need for understanding. There's no need for healing. There's only a need to destroy. And in Bonhoeffer's case, he did participate with family members who were involved in the plot to kill Hitler. So it has that sort of feel to it. For those reasons, most churches, based on their demographics, urban or rural, have aligned in the hyperpartisan debate, and they have not created a space where they can have dialogue on many of the key issues. Many of the key issues are not political, by the way, but they've been seen through a partisan lens. There's another reason. A lot of ministers have told me that they really fear pissing off their members. So if you're in a small church, you have to you depend on that small income that's coming in each week from the offering and so forth. A few lost members could be quite deadly who get pissed off. Many churches, though their ministers might have one political worldview, are quite diverse within them. And so the whole idea of bringing up anything that's controversial is really scary for pastors, particularly in a congregational governance structure where you depend on your members. So many have said, I wouldn't touch any hot button issues with a 10-foot pole. A number of ministers, both ministers and lay people in our denomination, have told me that they have a policy of checking any policy or politics discussions out the door. They do not want them in there. The church is a place to read about the scriptures and study how we can be better Christians. It does not involve getting into hot button issues. So that is another big reason. So you can see that both the clergy are themselves hyper partisan, and the many fear pissing people off. And by the way, all these arguments, there's some truth to what everybody is saying in this. I would argue that following Jesus does require courage, and that we have an obligation to be peacemakers in the midst of a time when it's almost impossible to get a dialogue or discussion or hear different viewpoints. And I think a great place to start is church. This is Church of the Holy City in Washington, D.C. And I think church is a great place to start, and it's a good way to put your toe in the water of facilitating discussion. One thing we started at Church of the Holy City was we began, after the sermon, hosting a discussion about the sermon. And I'll say that since we started doing it, I would never go back again to not doing it, because it's made worship so much more rich. And it's a very natural space. We're talking about the sermon, we're in a holy space, but people are not used to having a discussion about what they've just heard, and many pastors tell me this idea scares them to death. But it's a great way to begin the practice of civil discussions. And it's a very safe way because it's sermons, which people are familiar with. We've done a couple different styles of this. One, we used to do it right after the sermon, but it became so popular that, and some people were not interested, that we said, here's the sermon, we do the prayers, the benediction, and we have what we call a social hour has become a discussion hour about that. Jokingly, we've referred to it Ask a Minister Anything, because even though the goal is to talk about what the sermon was about, the topics can be completely wide-ranging, though very often theological. Politics comes into these discussions, so if I'm so concerned about political discourse and having those civil discussions, why am I suggesting church? This is a natural and great way to begin the practice. And it teaches everyone that the minister doesn't have all the answers, that there's wisdom in the group, but it also begins the practice of listening to others and being more thoughtful in your own response. We've come up with some ground rules that we've evolved organically. We did not do a good job of presenting these in the very beginning, but this has sort of grown out of trial and error, and we are constantly adding and fixing and evolving with our ground rules. But I found these ground rules to be particularly helpful to holding discussions in church. And the first is that encourage people to listen first. That is a new trait in our culture. It's an unusual trait in our culture. We all want to share what we think. The second is be curious, especially when you're getting upset. And this is a great spiritual practice for all of us. When you're really so angry at someone else's perspective, I really encourage you to ask yourself, well, where did they come to that perspective from? How did that happen? I wonder what in their life brought them to that. Curiosity is a wonderful way to engage people. Being humble, even beginning your comments from my perspective, or I don't necessarily know if I have the answer here, but this is something that shows that you're listening humbly. We also stress that it's great to ask questions. We do have sermonizers in the past that gave whole sermons, tried to give whole sermons until they were facilitated. But by asking a question, you're also being humble and you're saying, this is what I don't know. I'm curious, but it is hard for many people to ask questions. We also encourage people to rephrase what others say. That demonstrates that you're listening to what's going on and the conversation is much more rich. Of course, keep it brief is super important and super challenging. And if you've done anything in a church, you know that's a challenge. And then finally, ending on time, respecting people's time. This is particularly true for new young members who have really tight schedules. So these are some of the ground rules that we've come up with and apply pretty much across the board. Sermons are also a great place to introduce other topics beyond just what might be in the gospel that week. So we've used the church service building off of first sermons, and then we broached into other topics. For facilitators who are doing this, and this is often the pastor, but it doesn't need to be, it could be a church member, I do suggest that you start with really a desire of love for everybody involved. You can begin them with prayer, but certainly you yourself should begin in prayer. This is the hardest, particularly for ministers to hear, but any facilitator. Resist the need to share your opinion. What you will find is people don't really care as much. Much more important is for people to be heard than to have the leader share their perspective. So play a bit of a neutral role. Don't defend. Very often it's natural when you see, particularly if it's your position and it's being criticized, it's natural to want to defend. Let go of that ability to defend or be right. It's unnecessary. Critical is to protect underdog positions. If you have people who view things in a minority perspective, they are listening very carefully to how they're treated. So when they start stepping out with their perspective and you shoot them down immediately, they will clam up. They'll know this is not a place where it's safe to be an underdog in the position. Giving a lot of power, in a way, to the underdog position, saying, well, I really respect that, could be the role of the facilitator. I think this is really important. And the underdog can change in different groups, but it is the position that has the least power in that discussion. Finally, people interpret what I'm teaching as a way to get to agreement, and I'm not. I actually believe that disagreement is healthy, and I think variety of viewpoints are healthy. What I'm trying to convey here, and I think that these events do, is that we can disagree and respect each other. And that's what's missing in the culture. That is not being taught in the culture. So don't worry about everybody coming together with some sort of conclusion that we all agreed and we're all in this together and but yeah, stress common viewpoints, stress commonalities when you see them, but don't necessarily force agreement. Those are some of the guides for the facilitators. So where do we get these topics? This is me with Reverend Joseph Smith, who's a good friend of mine. They come from the headlines. So he had read the story of this African-American man whose brother was shot by a white police officer in Texas. And I had posted that I wanted to speak about the power of forgiveness. I was moved by the African-American brother to the white police officer, and this photograph is them hugging. And he trusts me enough and knows me well enough and said, I am sick of this. I'm sick of black people having to apologize to white people. And I'm really angry about what you're going to preach about. So I said, why don't you come in and let's do it together? And we did. We had an amazing discussion. So that comes right out of the headlines. Other topics that we've been open to doing, for example, we're right next to Virginia, and the governor of Virginia was seen with blackface. This has been common for a lot of political leaders. And it really tore up members of the church about where they should support or not support and so forth. So we had a discussion. I usually, more than one person should not be just leading it themselves, the facilitator. Get different viewpoints, take the pressure off one person, and share perspectives possibly. So that we had that one. This turned out to be a very potent topic. Another topic, we're in Washington, D.C., so you can imagine many of our community was at the protests of a nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. But rather than just let that lie with differing viewpoints, we had completely different viewpoints on that. We opened that up for a discussion as well in a group setting. So these are hot button issues. They're on people's mind. The church has traditionally said, leave your topics like this at the door. Come in and we'll talk about the gospel. And I'm arguing that let's bring them in and see what a Christian response could be to hearing each other. Again, not necessarily having to agree. Here, we've also used the podium for interfaith dialogue. On this one, it was about the topic of Islam and Rumi and Swedenborg. And the really cool thing about this is it brings in a whole new audience of people who have different viewpoints, which is fantastic. It brings in other expertise. I learned a lot. And it's just a wonderful way to say to another community, we love and respect you enough to learn about what your views are on this topic. So that's a wonderful forum as well. One important thing I want to say about interfaith dialogue is I've never started an interfaith dialogue by saying, I believe Jesus is God, you don't, let's get started. I don't pick the thing that is the most divisive. We actually look for things that we have in common and we go from there. And I think that's a good lesson for all civic dialogue, that we could say what we had in common. I'll just say in the case of Rumi and Swedenborg, it was mind-blowing how similar their worldview was. Everyone was surprised. We also got into the topic of Korean foreign policy. We have Korean members in the church, and there was a Buddhist monk from South Korea who is the best way to describe is the Dr. Phil of South Korea. And he came to testify before Congress, but wanted a forum to talk with Americans. We hosted that. It was broadcast in South Korea. So people were participating both within the church, but also in South Korea. And again, we shared different viewpoints and had a lovely conversation. And I certainly learned a lot about Korea. So it could be foreign policy, it could be interfaith, and it could be right out of the headlines. You'll notice that in the topics that we discussed that underlying a lot of them actually was racism. And I don't need to tell you right now when I'm recording this that our country is in great turmoil and torment over this issue. And I find that we've only begun to scratch the surface. Here's Skylar from our church, Annabelle Parker, our vice president, and Reverend Smith, who's a good friend and helps in a lot of these. And we actually did a follow-up podcast to talk about racism. And I think this topic, as far as I'm concerned, is people are so afraid to engage in an honest discussion, a safe, honest discussion, and make mistakes and be loved by each other and have all viewpoints respected, that it drives a lot of it underground and it ends up playing out in very horrible ways. So I think racism is an issue that has come up like a lot for us. Politics, the topic that I was pointing to at the very beginning that I think is driving a lot of the polarization, our political system. We're fortunate in our church. Annabelle Park is a leading progressive in the United States. So she founded the Coffee Party in response to the Tea Party. She's been a champion of immigrant issues and has a huge following. She has been a great person to do this with me. My politics are sort of center right, and I've been involved with Republican and conservative politics. And so I try to offer that perspective in a city like Washington. That's a very minority perspective. Most people don't know a Republican or a conservative. So I try to offer that perspective that's often not in the room. Annabelle's great at articulating the progressive view. And she and I have even explored a podcast we call Democracy in America that she records often in her van that she travels around in. And we're in her van here doing it. But politics is it's the very touchy subject where I'm going to spend a little bit more time on because it's the most difficult. One funny anecdote for me in the Swedenborgian denomination is there has not really been a convention that I've gone to where someone doesn't pull me aside and chastise me and say, how can you be Swedenborgian and Republican? And at that same convention, there's someone who pulls me aside and says, I'm more conservative, but I'm afraid to speak my mind at convention or in my church because it's so liberal. So even though we might think of our denomination as sort of very united on politics, we're divided, and we can very much benefit from hearing varieties of perspectives that we either haven't heard, in some cases we've submerged. There's real value in doing this. In each of these cases, you see, I had a partner. Having partners is really a great way. It's just getting beyond the minister model at the church that I talked about originally. I love it because you're using the same rules that I had started with, those 9, but you're also bringing new participants, new worldviews. It's educational. And as I said, I love that it sends a message to whoever you're participating with. If it's done right, it tells them, we value you, your perspective. We think we need it to be heard in our setting. Okay, mistakes. Mistakes along the way that I have made that might be helpful as you're thinking it through. And mistakes, I would say, one, this is difficult. Dialogue is difficult for a consumer culture that's used to getting what it wants, when it wants, and has not really been challenged. So participants have been very frustrated at times, and frustrated with me for even hosting it. So that earlier on I said that some ministers said they didn't want to piss people off. We have pissed people off, particularly if we have to tell them to follow the rules. They get hurt feelings when not following the rules. Particularly sermonizers, people who cannot ask a question, they must preach to you. That's a challenge and a mistake. We keep trying to improve it. I don't think we've gotten completely through it. And then we've also had mistakes where the facilitators themselves get frustrated with the situation and kind of are at a loss for words. And so that's another a tough thing. And again, I encourage facilitators, let it go. You don't need to be right. You just need to be honoring all perspectives in that discussion. Let me tell you what worked. This is our church president with a member, Helen Saris, with Maria de Los Angeles, a member of our church, listening to her and participating. What worked, and maybe the photograph of Helen is really wonderful, because what worked is we've had tearful breakthroughs. People have said, I have not ever been heard. I have not been respected. That's a breakthrough. People have had breakthroughs in new positions. I said that our goal is not to get everybody on the same page, but we do have people almost always evolve in their positions, and sometimes tearfully so. It's powerful. But most important is people say, wow, you two, you were discussing, really loved each other in the process of your disagreement. There was respect and disagreement, and I don't see that anywhere else. So that's super important, and those are really beautiful moments, and why I'm inspired to keep doing it. Now, if this is stressing you out, this seems like a lot of work, Rich. I'm not steeped in politics, and I'm not steeped in facilitation skills. There's a lot of professional help you can get. One, and we can share notes on this in the afterward, is something called the Collaborative Operating System, which I have actually helped do a training at Wayfarers. They did a training in Collaborative Operating System. It's a great system for how to manage events, meetings, and so forth that give voice to everyone. There's also, in the space of politics, there are many groups that you could also reach out to. There's a group called Living Room Conversations. The founder, Joan Blades, is the founder of MoveOn.org. She and I wrote an op-ed for Newsweek at the beginning of this year. It looks a little lame and as things turned out, but we were basically saying that our country was so divided that we really needed to commit to the golden rule, and that didn't work out as well as we liked. But having her and I write it together and on a spiritual principle, and her group, Living Room Conversations, are really pros at facilitating difficult conversations, and they do it all around the country. And she's a perfect example of a person who is definitely progressive in her politics, but has an amazing sense of making all voices heard and respected. This is their site. They heal divides by starting conversations. And then there's another group called the National Institute for Civil Discourse. It was actually founded in the, there was basically an assassination attempt of a congresswoman from Arizona, and this grew out of it. And they've started something called the Golden Rule for political discussions, and they're trying to bring spiritual principles to political discussions around the country. They're pros, again, at facilitating these discussions, and now they're trying to bring these two together. This is really wonderful for churches. They're all over the country, and now they could also do things online, so they'd be an excellent partner as well. They even put into their most recent website update, congregations can take action, incorporate a short liturgy, prayers, readings, apply the golden rule. So they're actually very interested in the church space and might be an interesting partner. There's a group called, formerly known as Better Angels, now Braver Angels. Again, they hold left-right dialogues all around the country. They are also piloting in churches and would be another great partner to work with. So politics is by far the most difficult topic, going back to the beginning of my presentation, and I want to give you some prep for political topics. This is not the place to start if you're just doing this for the first time, but you can build up to it. This is challenging because of the hyperpartisanship. I will point out that hatred of a political opponent is culturally accepted and encouraged. It's the one place where if you're in your tribe and you mock someone from the other side, make fun of, show hatred toward and hate within your heart, it is actually encouraged in the culture. It's not discouraged. I believe that really getting to this work is a spiritual practice. It's going to take some work. What I suggest is you really need to spend time learning the languages of all perspectives. I'll give some ideas how you can do it, but I think you could just start by, one, engaging with friends who have different political views, reading media of different political views on a regular basis. but really getting outside your bubble. And it's actually hard work now because of what I described as the media bubbles we live in. Beware of your own bias. Most people in the political realm really think they're not biased because they're just fighting evil. Well, that's a bias. And so if we stay in that space and both sides continue, we're going to have violent repercussions. Beware of your need to win. Just relax and listen to other perspectives. It's going to be okay. Be patient. It does take patience, particularly when you're hearing perspectives you really don't agree with and you really want to jump in, but having a space for those people to be heard can be very valuable. I'm going to speak briefly about a philosophical world of integral theory. Uses a phrase coined by Ken Wilber, transcend and include. And what it means is that you can transcend worldviews that you don't necessarily agree with, but you can include the best of them. So what can you find in a differing political viewpoint that's valuable? That's valuable. Instead of casting it all as evil. When it comes to politics, I'm going to suggest that you might choose areas that you're familiar with. Christianity, you could talk about a Swedenborgian approach or a Christian response to. And you're on safe ground and you're a Christian, you have a response, so you can say what you want. So that might be a safe place to start. I really do avoid candidates for the charged reasons because I avoid debate style. Because that's what the culture teaches us, that we're in a debate, we're scoring points, we're owning the libs, as we say in the conservative side of things. That energy is unhelpful. It's to crush the other person. It's a boxing match. I'm basically seeking to show mutual respect. Avoid left-right. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a coming slide, but if you think the world is divided between conservatives and liberals or Republicans and Democrats, you're operating in a very binary and limited worldview. It's much more complicated, and that won't help you by trying to cast things as left versus right. I really do ask when I do trainings on this topic for, at the end of it, a real test of this is, can you argue the perspective from the other side? In other words, take a position that you feel strongly about, give the best argument that your opponent might give you. And when I do trainings like this, and I actually did a mini training like this with General Counsel, I did ask participants to articulate opposing viewpoints in explaining current events. And that's a fun game, and that's a fun exercise. And something, if we were together, I could actually ask you to give me a topic and give me a political worldview, and I could give you an articulate view, not a cartoon view. You might also try smaller venues to get started when it comes to politics. I find meals are great. I find 12 is the limit. And using the collaborative operating system that I spoke about, create a check-in, bring people into the room by saying, what brings you here? What are you interested in tonight? And check out. And the checkouts, how did this serve you tonight? What did you think? What did you learn? Any feedback on it? The checkouts have been spiritually very powerful because people say, I can't believe I was in a setting where I heard viewpoints and I really respected the people that I disagreed with. So it's quite meaningful. That might be a structure as well. So you can see, if you're just getting started, smaller venues and meals might work best. If you really want to do this, and I believe this is the role of Christian leaders, you've got to become a translator. You've got to learn the different languages. And I often describe us as translators at the Tower of Babel. Our culture is a Tower of Babel right now. Spiritual leaders must be able to bring people together. That means hearing what one person's saying and hearing what another person and saying, this is what you're saying, and I understand what you're saying. Being able to hear people in the different languages they speak. And we are literally speaking languages. One small example, when I teach lobbying and policy for nonprofits, I warn participants, when you go up to the Hill, within 30 seconds, that staffer will know what political party you're aligned with based on your language. And they'll decide whether to check out mentally or to continue listening. That's how powerful these languages are to learn. And people in your congregation or in the group, they've got that antenna and they're listening for your language very carefully to see if it's going to be safe for them to speak. I said earlier that this is no longer left and right. I just point to this group where actually a lot of colleagues that I've worked with in politics for the years have ended up. But it's called the Lincoln Project, and they're running ads against the current president. And it's probably the most damaging ads out there right now against the Republican president are coming from Republicans. What I've discovered in this work is the divisions within the right and the left are as profound as left-right. So again, if you get into a binary, are you a Republican or a Democrat, you're really missing out on what's going on. It's much more complicated. This is the integral theory map. I can't get too deep into it today, but it's a training into itself. But I encourage you to open yourself up to it. What it does is it says that people have operated through different value systems throughout history, and they're constantly evolving. And today, we've gone from traditional to modern to postmodern. We're entering an integral period. They also make a case that this is the first time in history where traditional, modern, and postmodern are in it together. And so many of the battles that we call left-right are actually taking place through value systems on this map. I love this as a Swedenborgian because integral for me points to the holy city descending, the New Jerusalem, from my perspective. So I wrote this long piece for Quillette magazine in September, and I go through all the political dialogue, and I go through all the types of value systems that exist out there and what categories they're in. So I encourage you to read that. You'll see that I have broken them down into 6. I'm not going to go into them here. It's too long, but you'll see that, again, break out of your left-right. It's a lot more complicated out there. And you'll need that to understand commonalities that confuse you. Why would someone vote for Trump this time who voted for Obama last time? That map might make more sense for you. So Swedenborg says, love consists in desiring to give what is your own to another and feeling his or her delight as your own. I encourage us to really live for each other, live for the other person involved, and that means getting beyond our own selfish worldview and being a facilitator of a variety of worldviews. If not now, when, and if not who, you, is a great motto that Hillel stated, and it speaks to our time. And then when we have time, we will have a live time of feedback and confession, not confessions, maybe confessions, but questions. And I will look forward to getting your questions. I know there's a lot of information there, and I'm happy to share the slides with you and help set you up as you begin this work. But thank you very much for attending.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us today. My name is Becky Greenwood, and I'm the editor of The Messenger. We've just watched Blessed Are the Peacemakers, How You and Your Church Can Successfully Facilitate Political Dialogue in a Polarized Society. I'd like to welcome my friend, Reverend Rich Tafel, the pastor of our national church in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much today for taking the time to put this together for us, Rich.
Well, thank you, Becky, for facilitating it.
Oh, absolutely. I always enjoy our conversations, and then we have a few minutes to answer some of the questions that came through in your presentation, and we had several great comments as we both expected we would. Something that I've been educating myself on the past couple of years is the media bias. And what Amanda's comment about the New York Times podcast, The Daily, has done a series called The Rabbit Hole, and outlining the YouTube algorithm and how it radicalizes, and it's terrifying. Can you go into some more information about the radicalization and the media biases?
Yeah, really quickly, the media is in the profit-making business of selling advertising. It is not so much a journalism to share information. And so things like YouTube have what they call a continuous loop. Once you start watching someone, they will take you, quote, down the rabbit hole of other speakers in that field. So you'll keep watching. And people are watching millions and millions of hours of YouTube now. It's actually replacing television. This is really happening in the political world. What it does is it takes you into a bubble, and it takes you very deep into a bubble, and you're not hearing other perspectives. So what we're doing generally is editing our media, our social media. We're picking our friends, we're cutting off friends we disagree with, And so we're hearing echo chambers of our own viewpoints. And there's a lot of virtue signaling online, and even the press now has become polarized. People can kind of guess what side the press will be on an issue. So that's a very good podcast series, The Rabbit Hole, and it does take you through the stories of people who got wrapped up in social media.
Yeah, it's really a huge thing, especially now with the millennials and the Generation Z. They live by YouTube. Terry C asks that some topics are not inherently political, but have been brought into the political arena to promote polarization. Would you say that some topics currently regarded as political are humanitarian or moral or something else, and the church would be correct in taking a stance, or should all of these topics be debated by all sides?
That's a great question. And I think there were other questions about masks, for example, in the culture. I mentioned that in my presentation. So it kind of ties in. My theory is that right now, because the most powerful meaning-making system people have is the partisan meaning-making system. They're now looking at all information through a lens of the tribes that they're on, for the most part. So when anything happens in the world, and the pandemic's a good example, at first we were confused, but then we quickly went to our corners and we turned it into a political scoring opportunity. And just to give it, and just to speak to the masks, and to Terry's point about how the humanitarian is getting used by politics, that's a really good example. Now, if you're progressive, you probably did not react negatively to the lack of masks at the protest. If you're, but my progressive friends were all lecturing about people going and protesting in Michigan. If you're on the right, there's this whole now meme around masks being freedom of speech and so forth, and could have very detrimental effects to the Republican Party, for example, because those states kind of turned it to a political issue, and it's having a backfiring effect. So I think there is, we all have our truth, and I didn't say this enough in it. I have my beliefs. I can see all perspectives generally, but I have my own beliefs. I have a truth. And at times the church has to lead on issues. And I've certainly in my life kind of taken controversial issues and led on them publicly. So I think the church has to do that as well. But I do think that the desire to repress viewpoints that we disagree with means that they will come back to us in much more negative ways.
Right. We have a little bit more time here. From Amanda, she says she wants to know if your friend Reverend Smith feels a similar pull to keep politics out of the church, like many in the white church.
Reverend Smith, who I mentioned in the presentation, Joseph, obviously from the Black church, and the Black church has been very involved politically. It's been much more engaged politically and much more political discussion. So it tends to have less of that. What was, I think, surprising for him is there is a view, I would say, I'll speak for him, in the Black community, that the white church doesn't want to do politics, and particularly doesn't want to talk about racism. So he was very shocked and pleased that there was a place where he could hear. And just to give a concrete example of how that went from a political to a spiritual discussion, in that discussion about forgiveness, he said, God condemns people to hell who do evil things. So that was a theological discussion. And I got a chance to say, in our tradition, we choose heaven or hell, and there is not a condemnation to it. And he said, wow, that gives me a new way to look at this particular topic. So it's a beautiful opportunity to bring in the theological and the political. And I think that the Black church is far advanced in holding these discussions and much more open and kinder, actually, to viewpoints that disagree with them.
Good. That's also helpful where we're all at right now. Another comment from Joyce B. We have time for about one more question. She's not concerned about her church family, but her other Christian friends that are not Swedenborgian are intimidating to try to discuss social issues with. Do you have suggestions for how to handle that?
Yeah, in a way, that's the challenge of getting outside the bubble, because we do have the people that I think Swedenborg and Jesus both imply that loving your family and loving your extended family, that's not enough. We really do have to love our neighbor, and that's particularly the neighbor that could be driving us crazy. And so I would look at it as an opportunity. It can be intimidating, and they may not have the same rules, but if you can start with the guidelines, it would be highly educational to listen to their viewpoint, even if you don't get your own viewpoint heard as much. but you will learn a lot to understand their mindset, and you'll actually listen to the news and current events in a different way. So I encourage all of us to get outside of our churches, do things with other groups, as you saw that we are doing that. And it also brings a new audience and a chance to hear about our own teachings.
Great. We're at time, but we have so much interaction and so many comments and so many questions throughout. You said you're willing to continue this conversation another call.
Yeah, if anybody's interested, it's my email is richtafel@gmail. So if anybody emails me and says, I'd like to do a Zoom call to kind of go over this in a little bit more depth, there's a lot of information there. I'd be happy to do another Zoom call with anybody who's interested, because we did have a lot of unanswered questions, and that's
yeah, that would be amazing.
And that's the pastor's fault for talking too long.
You want you to just put your email in the comment section and people can just get it from there.
Yes.
So that's all we have time for right now. And thank you, Reverend Tafel, for joining us. And also, people are asked to continue the conversation in the comment section. Coming up next at 7 o'clock Eastern time is the Sweden Border Church Youth League's worship service, which is always great. So hopefully you'll all join us then. See you later.